20 years ago, humanity went silent. No broadcasts, no diplomatic channels, no trade convoys crossing the old border routes. Every station that once carried a human signal simply stopped, all at once on the same day, as if an entire species had been switched off. The galaxy noticed. For a while it even wondered. Then it moved on. The way empires always move on from questions they'd rather not spend resources answering. This is the story of what happened when the silence finally broke. The Threll Ascendancy had built its entire border strategy around one simple assumption, that a species which goes dark for 2 decades has either collapsed from within or simply isn't worth the fuel it would cost to go find out. Fleet Marshal Corin Asheville had built his entire career on that same assumption, and it had never once failed him. Border Station 7 is picking up something on the old human relay frequencies, his intelligence officer told him, stepping into his command chamber aboard the flagship Ascendant Will. First activity in 20 years, Marshal. Asheville did not look up from the reports on his desk. Human relay frequencies have been dead for 2 decades. It's decayed hardware. Old satellites finally losing structural integrity and venting static into a channel nobody's monitored in years. It happened 3 times this month, sir. Same encoding pattern each time. That's not decay, that's discipline. Asheville set down his report slowly. In 30 years of service, he had learned exactly one lesson worth trusting completely. Decayed hardware did not repeat itself with precision. "Show me," he said. 400 light-years past the old human border, beneath the surface of a moon no ascendancy star chart had ever properly catalogued, a species the galaxy had quietly written off as either extinct or irrelevant had spent 20 years doing neither. They had gone dark on purpose, and they were done being quiet. 21 years earlier, the Threll Ascendancy had arrived at the edge of human space exactly as it had arrived at the edge of 30 other emerging civilizations before it. Not with conquest, not at first, but with something the Ascendancy considered far more efficient. A trade agreement so favorable to itself, and so carefully worded, that within a decade it would have quietly stripped Earth of every resource worth extracting and left behind a client state too dependent on ascendancy technology to ever refuse another demand. Human negotiators, still new to interstellar diplomacy, still fractured across a dozen competing national interests that had never fully unified even after decades of spacefaring capability, signed that agreement believing they had secured a partnership. They had secured, instead, the opening move of a conquest so gradual that most humans never even recognized it as one. It took 11 years for the truth to become undeniable. Ascendancy trade quotas had climbed steadily every year, always justified, always reasonable in isolation, until Earth's own industries depended entirely on ascendancy shipping lanes for materials Earth itself had once mined and refined without anyone's permission. Ascendancy advisory missions had embedded themselves in Earth's remaining governing bodies, always helpful, always insistent, until entire ministries answered to ascendancy liaisons before they answered to their own elected councils. By the 12th year, a small group within Earth's remaining unified defense apparatus understood exactly what was happening, and understood that saying so openly would only accelerate the very takeover they were trying to prevent. They chose, instead, to disappear. Fleet Marshal Corin Asheville had never needed to personally investigate an old client relationship gone quiet. He found the assignment beneath his rank entirely. 20 years of silence from a species we practically owned outright, he told his executive officer, a sharp-eyed Threll woman named Vera Kesh, as their cruiser Ascendant will prepare to break from its forward staging platform. This is a diplomatic footnote, not a fleet deployment. We'll find a broken relay, log a routine report, and be home within the week. Marshall, the client agreement with Sol 3 was never formally terminated, Kesh said, reviewing the old files as their ship prepared for departure. By treaty, we still hold extraction rights across their entire system. If they've reorganized without notifying us, that's a material breach. They haven't reorganized, Asheville said. They've collapsed, or they've scattered, or they've simply stopped mattering enough to maintain the paperwork. 20 years of silence doesn't happen to a healthy client state. It happens to a dying one. He was not entirely wrong that something significant had happened to the client state, he remembered. He was catastrophically wrong about what? The Ascendant Will was a capable cruiser by Ascendancy standards. 400 meters, respectable shielding. A crew of 500, entirely sufficient by every calculation available to Asheville for investigating a lapsed client relationship at the edge of a quiet system. Set a course, he said. Standard escort. We're checking on an old asset, not preparing for a campaign. He did not know that beneath the ice of a moon 3 light towers from Earth, an engineering directorate 2 decades deep into an uninterrupted, deliberate silence, had already detected his cruisers approach the moment it crossed the outer debris field. A debris field the Ascendancy's own sensors registered as nothing but leftover wreckage from decommissioned mining equipment. "They're finally coming to check on us," said Director Amara Solis, watching the contact resolve on a screen buried deep beneath ancient ice, in a control chamber that had run continuous silent shifts for 2 full decades. One cruiser, standard configuration, nothing our perimeter can't manage if it comes to that. Her second-in-command, a younger officer who had been a child when the silence first began, studied the readout carefully. "Do we let them find nothing, the way we did the last 2 probes? Bury the signal, stay quiet, let them file another routine report and leave?" Solis considered the question for a long moment, remembering the exact meeting, 20 years earlier, where the decision to disappear had first been made. "No," she finally said. 20 years is long enough to build what we came here to build. I think it's time the Ascendancy learned exactly what its old client state became while it wasn't looking. She reached for a secure channel and routed a priority message to the surface, to a combined defense council that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment for 2 decades. The answer came back within the hour, calm and unequivocal. "Let them see everything." Fleet Admiral Renata Cho had been preparing for this exact message for most of her adult career, the way the founders of the Silence had prepared for it 2 decades earlier. "They're finally close enough to notice us again," she said, addressing the Combined Defense Council in a chamber built into reclaimed Ascendancy infrastructure that Earth's engineers had quietly repurposed over 20 years of patient reconstruction. "It's time to stop managing the silence and start managing what comes after it." Counselor Imre Tanaka, one of the original architects of the disappearance 20 years earlier, nodded slowly. "We always knew this day would come eventually. The only real question was whether we'd built enough in the time we had to make the reveal worth the risk." "Have we?" asked a younger council member. Tanaka looked around the chamber at faces representing 2 full decades of careful, deliberate work. Engineers who had reverse-built entire industries' humanity had once surrendered to Ascendancy dependency. Soldiers who had trained in secret using doctrine built from studying every weakness in the Ascendancy's own captured technology. Diplomats preparing for a conversation none of them had ever expected to have this soon. "We've had 20 years to get ready," Tanaka said. "I think we'll manage." The Ascendant Will dropped out of warp at the edge of the Sol system 3 days later, sensors sweeping automatically for the source of the old relay signal. What its instruments found instead made Fleet Marshal Corin Asheville rise slowly from his command chair. "Report," he said. "Marshal, we're reading." Kesh's voice faltered, staring at her console as though it might correct itself. "We're reading full industrial independence. Refineries, shipyards, agricultural domes, all operating without a single ascendancy signature anywhere in the supply chain. This system hasn't just recovered from the trade dependency we built into it. It's severed every trace of that dependency completely. That's not possible, Asheville said. Our own extraction data showed this system barely self-sufficient 20 years ago. They needed our shipping lanes for basic industrial materials. They needed them 20 years ago, Marshall, Kesh said. I'm not sure what to call what I'm reading now, and there's something else. She hesitated. Ship formations positioned at the edge of our detection range. A great many of them arranged in a pattern that isn't defensive. It's encircling. The view screen resolved the picture a moment later, and every officer on the bridge of the Ascendant went silent at once. Where 20 years of ascendancy trade reports had insisted upon a fragile, dependent client system barely holding itself together, there now floated a civilization operating with complete self-sufficiency. Orbital shipyards larger than anything in the old survey data, agricultural stations catching sunlight along every viable orbit, and behind them all, arranged patiently in the dark at the very edge of detection range. A fleet the Ascendancy's own intelligence had never once accounted for in any threat assessment. That's impossible, Asheville whispered. 20 years. 20 years of silence, and all of this was growing here the entire time, right under a treaty we thought still bound them to us. It had not merely been growing. It had been built, deliberately and precisely, by a species that had studied every weakness in its own captured ascendancy technology and used 2 decades of uninterrupted secrecy to surpass it. Signal them, Asheville said, voice tight. Demand explanation for this material treaty violation. His sensor officer, a younger Threll named Doran, spoke up carefully from her station. Marshal, before we do, I'm reading weapons signatures on those distant ships. The harmonic profile is unlike anything in our threat catalog. I can't classify what those systems actually do. Meaning what precisely? Meaning whatever they built in 20 years of silence, we have no defense doctrine prepared for it, Doran said. None at all. The channel opened before Asheville's own message could even finish transmitting. A woman appeared on the screen, steady eyes, no fear in her expression at all. Ascendancy Cruiser Ascendant Will, she said, you are inside a system that terminated its treaty obligations to your empire 19 years ago. I'm going to ask you once to reverse course. Asheville stared at her, fury and disbelief warring across his features. That treaty was never formally terminated. Our records show continuous extraction rights. The woman's expression did not change. Your records are 20 years out of date, she said. That was rather the point of the silence. To understand what Fleet Marshal Corin Asheville was truly looking at, one had to go back to the 12th year of the original trade agreement, when a small group within Earth's defense apparatus first understood exactly what was happening to their world. They gathered in a reclaimed facility beneath a mountain range that had once housed a fraction of Earth's old orbital defense infrastructure, carrying with them classified assessments of exactly how deeply ascendancy dependency had embedded itself into every human industry that mattered. Among them was an economist named Dr. Amara Solis, no relation to the director who would one day watch the ascendant wheels approach from beneath lunar ice, though history would later note the coincidence with some fondness, who had spent 3 years quietly documenting exactly how the trade agreement's favorable terms had been engineered, clause by clause, to create irreversible dependency rather than mutual benefit. They didn't invade us, she told the survivors gathered around her. They didn't need to. They simply made certain that within another decade we would ask them to stay, because leaving would collapse everything we'd built around their supply lines. That is a slower conquest than a war, but it is a conquest all the same. An older council member, a retired admiral named Diego Reyes, who had watched ascendancy advisors quietly displace his own command staff over successive years, studied her carefully across the assembled group. "You're suggesting we cut the dependency entirely," he said, "all at once, knowing it will look to them exactly like collapse." "I'm suggesting we let them believe it is collapse," Solis said. "There's a difference. We don't disappear because we're weak. We disappear because visibility right now is the only thing keeping their hand on our throat." A younger voice spoke up from the back of the gathering, a logistics officer named Priya Nandan, holding a data pad full of every industrial process Earth would need to rebuild from scratch without a single ascendancy component. "This will take longer than any of us have patience for, rebuilding refineries, shipyards, an entire supply chain from nothing in secret." "How long?" Reyes asked. Priya studied her projections carefully. 15 years if everything goes right. 20, more realistically, accounting for the mistakes we haven't made yet. Solis looked around the gathered survivors. "Then we start tonight, and we don't stop until it's done, however long that actually takes." The vote passed unanimously that night, in a chamber beneath a mountain, to begin a project built entirely on the discipline of letting an empire believe its client state had simply faded away, for exactly as long as that belief remained useful. For 20 years, every trace of independent human industry was built in facilities the old ascendancy trade surveys had never bothered to monitor closely. Hidden inside decommissioned mining platforms and reclaimed orbital wreckage, the ascendancy itself had once written off as economically worthless. The first 5 years were the hardest. Engineers who remembered the exact terms of the old dependency worked exhausting rotations, reverse engineering basic refining processes from salvaged ascendancy equipment, training a shrinking pool of specialists before critical knowledge could be lost to attrition or despair. Resource shortages nearly collapsed the entire effort twice in that first half-decade, forcing brutal rationing decisions that some council members never fully forgave themselves for making. The second 5 years brought the first true independent shipyards. Built inside asteroid fields, the ascendancy had never surveyed for anything beyond the minerals they'd already stripped from the surface decades earlier. The third 5 years brought the technological breakthroughs that changed everything. Propulsion and shielding systems built around principles reverse-engineered from ascendancy hardware, but refined past anything the ascendancy's own engineers had developed in generations of unchallenged trade dominance. By the final 5 years, humanity was no longer merely surviving independently. It was quietly becoming something the ascendancy's own outdated files had no accurate record of at all. "Marshal Asheville doesn't know it yet," said Fleet Admiral Renata Cho, addressing the Combined Defense Council in the days after the Ascendant Will's detection. "But he just found the best-kept secret restructuring in recent galactic history." Behind her, a display rotated slowly. A fleet built entirely from a species' own patient reinvention of technology it had once been dependent on, all of it grown inside a system, every ascendancy trade report still listed as barely self-sufficient. "We let an empire believe a lie for 20 years, Cho said. "Not because we feared confrontation, because confronting them too early, before we'd actually built independence, would have ended in exactly the kind of occupation the silence was designed to prevent. Now that a routine cruiser has stumbled onto the truth, we decide how the rest of the story gets told." A younger council member raised a hand. "Admiral, if the Ascendancy reports what they found, their central command will hear of it eventually. Shouldn't we detain that cruiser before it can transmit anything home?" Cho's expression didn't change. "We could. It would be simple. It would also make us exactly the kind of empire that engineered our dependency to begin with, just with better technology behind the threat." She turned back to the display. "Let the truth travel," she said. "On our terms this time, not the Ascendancy's." Phase 1 complete. Fleet Marshal Corin Asheville stared at the woman on his view screen, still struggling to reconcile 20 years of ascendancy trade assessments with the fleet now visible at the edge of his sensors. "You built all of this," he said slowly, "in complete secrecy, while our own reports insisted you were sliding toward economic collapse." "Yes," the woman replied. Her identification tag transmitted alongside the channel: Fleet Admiral Renata Cho, granddaughter of one of the engineers who had first documented the extent of ascendancy dependency 2 decades earlier. "We had good reason to let that assessment stand for as long as it served us." "Central Command will hear of this," Asheville said. "You cannot hide an independent fleet of this size forever, not now that we've found you." "We're aware," Cho said calmly. "That's precisely why you're going to leave this system today with an accurate account of exactly what you saw, instead of a version we had to force out of you by other means." Asheville's hand drifted toward his weapons console, an old instinct dying hard even as every sensor reading told him it would accomplish nothing. "You would let us leave, knowing we could report your fleet's exact strength to Central Command, knowing they might decide this warrants immediate reoccupation." "We'd prefer it," Cho said. "We've spent 20 years being patient about how this conversation would begin. We don't intend to spend the years after it being reckless, and detaining a cruiser that arrived under a treaty your own government still technically believes is active would be exactly that kind of recklessness." Behind Cho, across Earth's now fully restored broadcast network, more than 12 billion humans watched the exchange in real time, many of them witnessing the moment their entire adult lives had been quietly built toward without ever being told the full scope of the plan. "What do you want from us?" Asheville asked finally. "Tell Central Command the treaty is void," Cho said. "It has been for 19 years in every practical sense that matters. Tell them the client state they assumed was fading away instead spent 2 decades becoming something they never accounted for in a single one of their trade projections. And if Central Command decides to reassert the old treaty by force, now that they know the truth." Cho's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Then Phase 2 begins," she said. "And I promise you, Marshal, it will not go the way the original occupation was designed to go." Asheville studied her for a long moment, searching for the bluff he was certain had to exist somewhere in that steady voice. "And Finn?" "Ding none. You could have kept hiding," he said finally. "Why let one supply signal end this now, on a day you didn't choose?" "We didn't choose the day," Cho admitted. "But we chose, years ago, exactly what we'd do when a day like this arrived, because we always knew it eventually would. A rebuilding project this size doesn't stay hidden forever. We spent 20 years making certain that when it finally ended, it would end on terms we could live with, not terms forced on us by a fleet instead of a single curious cruiser." Phase 2 complete. Asheville had commanded warships for 30 years. He had never once needed to consider retreat as his opening strategic option in a system his own empire's treaty still claimed as a dependent client. "Bring up full defensive shields," he ordered, voice unsteady. "Prepare for withdrawal." "Marshal," Kesh said, staring at the tactical display, "the human fleet hasn't moved. They're not pursuing. They're not even fully powering their weapons systems. If anything, they've gone quieter since the transmission ended." "They don't need to power up," Asheville said quietly, finally understanding what every officer on that bridge was only beginning to grasp. "They've already won whatever this encounter was, the moment we saw the full scope of what they'd built. A demonstration of force would almost be beneath the point they're making." Doran, still monitoring sensors from her station, spoke up. "Marshal, I'm picking up something else. Training formations moving among the larger fleet. They're not simply maintaining a defensive posture. They're actively still expanding, even as we watch, 20 years in and clearly not finished." 20 years and they never stopped building," Asheville murmured. "Orders, Marshal." "Set course back to the staging platform," he said. full withdrawal, and prepare a full report for Central Command the moment we're back in range. They're going to want every detail, and I suspect this will not be the only cruiser sent to verify it personally. The Ascendant will reversed course and left the Sol system exactly as it had entered it. Quietly, without a single weapon discharged, carrying home a truth far more dangerous to the Ascendancy's old economic model than any weapon the ship itself could have fired. Not every officer aboard the retreating cruiser processed the encounter the same way. A young ensign named Torrin Vale, barely out of Ascendancy officer training, found himself staring out the observation deck's viewport long after Sol 3 had shrunk to a single point of light behind them. "You're quiet," Kesh said, finding him there during a routine deck check. "I keep thinking about the number," Torrin said. 20 years. One generation, essentially, spent quietly reversing an entire economic dependency we assumed was permanent. I don't know if we could do that if our positions were reversed. I don't know if any client world under Ascendancy trade terms could manage that kind of discipline. Kesh considered that for a long moment, watching the same point of light Torrin had been studying. "Let's hope we never have to find out," she finally said. Phase 3 complete. Word of the Ascendant Will's discovery reached Ascendancy Central Command within the month, carried by a report Asheville himself drafted with more care than any document he had filed in 30 years of service. A senior trade analyst named Vesa Orlin, who had personally certified the original Sol 3 agreement as one of the Ascendancy's most successful client integrations, found herself reviewing her own decades-old assessment with a discomfort she had never before associated with her work. "They want me to explain how an entire client economy achieved full independence without a single trade irregularity ever crossing my desk," she told her supervisor, an aging Threll administrator who had overseen client relations for longer than Vesa had been alive. 20 years and nothing. Not one flagged shipment, not one unusual resource request, nothing that should have told us this was happening. Her supervisor studied the old file for a long moment. "You didn't miss anything, Vesa. Read the numbers again. Every year, dependency looked exactly as stable as it had the year before. That's not an oversight. That's a species that understood exactly what our monitoring systems were built to catch, and built their entire recovery around never triggering a single one of those flags." "Then how do we file this?" Vesa asked. "As an intelligence failure, as a trade model in need of complete revision. Our entire client integration doctrine assumes dependency, once established, becomes permanent within a generation." Her supervisor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the old agreement's original terms, terms that had once seemed elegantly permanent and now read as nothing more than the opening chapter of a much longer story neither of them had seen coming. "File it as a warning," he finally said, "because that's what it actually is. Not to us specifically. To anyone in this empire who has ever assumed that a dependent world stays dependent simply because we stopped auditing it closely." Phase 4 complete. Earth did not celebrate the day the truth reached Ascendancy Central Command. There were no declarations of triumph, no broadcasts crowing over an empire outmaneuvered. Instead, Fleet Admiral Cho stood before the Combined Defense Council and delivered a report that echoed, in its restraint, the same discipline that had carried this project across 2 full decades. "The Ascendancy cruiser has withdrawn," she said. "No weapons discharged, no casualties on either side. They now possess an accurate account of our true independence, delivered on our terms rather than discovered through crisis or extracted through confrontation." "And Central Command?" asked Counselor Tanaka. "They'll respond eventually, through diplomatic channels or otherwise." Cho nodded slowly. "They will. And when they do, they'll learn that the client state they assumed was quietly fading into irrelevance spent every one of the last 20 years becoming something their own trade models never accounted for. We didn't rebuild to punish them for what the original agreement cost us. We rebuilt so that whatever comes next in this relationship, it will be negotiated between equals, not dictated to a dependent. A younger council member spoke quietly. Do you think they'll try to reassert the old treaty by force? Cho looked toward the display behind her, where a single blue-green world sat at the center of a fleet built entirely in patient, deliberate silence. I think, she said, that for the first time in 20 years it genuinely doesn't matter whether they try. That's the entire point of everything we built. Not that we'd never be found out. That when we finally were, the discovery would change nothing about our position. An older council member, one of the last still active who remembered the original vote to disappear, spoke from the far end of the chamber. There are those among the public who will ask why we don't use this fleet now, while the ascendancy is still absorbing the shock. Push back against every unfavorable term they ever wrote into that original agreement, all at once, while they're unprepared to resist. Cho turned to face the older man directly. We could. We have more than enough strength for it now. But dictating new terms through threat is just the same conquest we escaped, wearing our own flag instead of theirs. We didn't spend 20 years building independence just to abandon the principle of it in year 21 out of convenience. Then what do we do with a fleet this size, if not use it to settle old grievances? We let it exist, Cho said, openly, for the first time in this relationship. Not as a weapon aimed at anyone specific, but as proof that we rebuilt ourselves on our own terms. If the ascendancy or anyone else mistakes that restraint for weakness, they'll learn otherwise soon enough. But we will not be the ones who starts that lesson. Word of the silence's end spread slowly at first, carried through ascendancy trade channels never designed to carry news of this kind. Then faster through neighboring systems that had watched their own client relationships with the ascendancy grow more restrictive with each passing decade. On a border world called Kethais, itself bound by a client agreement disturbingly similar to the one Earth had escaped, a young trade minister found herself rereading the leaked reports late into the night. 20 years, she murmured to an aide, staring at the amended assessment on her console. 20 years of looking exactly as dependent as the year before, while building something the ascendancy never saw coming. What does it take to hold that kind of discipline for an entire generation? Her aide had no immediate answer, only a slow, thoughtful pause. Maybe the same thing it takes to hold any long plan together. Enough people who believe the ending is worth the wait, even if they never live to see it. On a mining colony bound to the ascendancy by terms even harsher than Earth's original agreement, a laborer named Des Volton heard the story secondhand from a trader passing through, and repeated it to his own children that night by lamplight. They let the ascendancy believe they were fading away, he told them, his youngest watching with wide, careful eyes. For 20 years, they built nothing anyone could see, kept every number looking exactly the way it was expected to look, until the day they didn't need to hide anymore. Why didn't they attack once they were strong enough? His son asked. Wouldn't that have punished the ascendancy for what they did? Des considered the question carefully, the way his own mother had once taught him to consider difficult things. Maybe, he said, because punishing them wasn't the point. Maybe the point was simply proving that dependency isn't have to be permanent, and that someone finally proved it without needing anyone's permission to try. On an oceanic world at the edge of ascendancy trade routes, an underground economic council that had spent decades quietly resisting the same kind of dependency Earth had escaped heard the story through smuggled data cores, passed hand to hand between settlements. The ascendancy's monitoring systems had never fully mapped. Their leader, an elder named Ussa Cold who had spent 30 years documenting every unfavorable clause buried inside her own world's trade agreements, addressed a small gathering of economists and engineers with words that would later circulate quietly across a dozen dependent worlds. For 20 years, we told ourselves that once a trade agreement locks independency, there's no path back to independence, she said. A world called Sol 3 spent 2 decades quietly proving that belief was never true. They didn't need a war. They needed patience and the discipline to hide their progress until it was actually finished. A younger member of the gathering raised a nervous hand. What if we don't have 20 years? What if our dependency is already too deep to reverse in a single generation? Us's expression softened slightly. Then we take however long it actually requires, and we use every year of it exactly as well as they used theirs. The lesson was never really about the number 20. It was about the discipline behind however many years it takes. 1 year after the Ascendant Will's discovery, Earth's Combined Defense Council released a single statement, broadcast across every channel willing to carry it, translated into every language the old Ascendancy trade network had ever touched. It read, 20 years ago, an agreement meant to bind us into permanent dependency instead taught us exactly how dependency is built, clause by clause, until leaving becomes unthinkable. We chose to make the unthinkable happen anyway. We let the appearance of decline stand for exactly as long as it served us, and not a day longer than necessary. We did not rebuild to punish anyone for the terms of an old agreement. We rebuilt because we decided, in a chamber beneath a mountain, that the next chapter of our economic future would be negotiated by equals, on our own timeline, according to our own judgment. Let this be understood clearly, by any world still counting itself permanently bound to a favorable trade partner. Dependency is not the same as destiny. Sometimes it is simply the condition of something patient, rebuilding exactly where no one thought to check the numbers closely enough. The statement ended, and across a dozen worlds still bound by agreements uncomfortably similar to the one Earth had escaped, it began to travel not as an instruction, but as a quiet, unshakable proof that even the most carefully engineered dependency did not have to be permanent. In the council chamber where the statement had been drafted, Counselor Tanaka watched the broadcast confirmation scroll across her console, then turned to Fleet Admiral Cho standing beside her. The ones who voted for the silence 20 years ago would have wanted to see this day, she said quietly. My grandmother used to say the same thing about all of us, Cho replied. That none of this belonged to any single generation of planners, that we were only ever caretakers of something that would outlast every one of our careers. And now the whole galaxy knows the truth. Now the whole galaxy knows we rebuilt, Cho corrected gently. What we do with that independence next is still entirely ours to decide. Tanaka walked to the chamber's viewport, looking out over the mountain range that had sheltered the very first planners 20 years earlier, now home to a memorial rather than a hidden command post. My predecessor used to say the hardest part wasn't the rebuilding itself, she said. It was explaining to an entire generation of engineers why their work had to stay invisible, year after year, with no public recognition at all, for the sake of a plan most of them wouldn't personally see finished. Do you think they understood while they were living through it? Some of them, Tanaka said. Others resented the secrecy for years before they came to understand it. I think that's the honest cost of any plan this long. Not everyone gets to feel proud of the work while they're still buried in the middle of it. Cho joined her at the viewport, watching the same mountains in comfortable silence. And now, she asked, now that the silence is finally over. Now, Tanaka said, we get to find out what independence actually looks like, rather than simply planning for the day we'd have it. I suspect that will take its own kind of discipline too. 20 years teaches a civilization how to disappear convincingly. It doesn't automatically teach it how to simply exist afterward, openly, without flinching at every old client obligation someone try. Ease to invoke. That sounds like the start of an entirely different project, Cho said. Maybe, Tanaka agreed. But at least this one we get to build without hiding a single part of it. 20 years after the Ascendant will first stumbled onto the truth, a new generation of humans stood on the observation deck of a shipyard built openly, in full sunlight, on the surface of the same moon that had once hidden Director Solis's control chamber deep beneath the ice. Among them was a young trade economist named Lena Volton, granddaughter of the laborer who had once told his children a bedtime story about a species that refused to stay dependent. She had grown up hearing that story not as folklore, but as the literal foundation of the career she now held, negotiating openly with a dozen worlds who had once been bound by agreements uncomfortably similar to Earth's original mistake. They still teach the old discipline in the economics academies, a visiting historian asked her, watching engineers and traders move freely across a platform that would have been unthinkable to hide 2 decades earlier. Even now, when there's no dependency left to escape. We don't teach it because we still need to escape anything, Lena said. We teach it because the patience it took to rebuild an entire economy from nothing is worth remembering, whether or not the circumstances that demanded it ever return. Do you think they will? Return, I mean. Another empire, another agreement engineered the same way. Lena considered the question, looking out at trade routes now negotiated in the open, no longer hidden, simply present. I think if they do, she said, we'll recognize the pattern in year 1 instead of year 11. And I think that's the real ending to the story my grandfather used to tell. Not that we escaped successfully, that we learned, once and for all, exactly what the beginning of that kind of dependency looks like before it ever has the chance to finish. Humanity had not faded away that year, 20 years earlier. It had simply understood, watching one clause after another quietly reshape its entire economy, that permanent dependency is rarely announced. It arrives gradually, reasonably, one favorable-sounding agreement at a time, and it had chosen, deliberately, across an entire generation, to become something no future trade assessment would ever again mistake for fragile. Phase 5 complete. If this one hit different, that's the point. The most dangerous empire isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one that went quiet on purpose and spent every year of that silence building the fleet nobody saw coming. Subscribe for more HFY sagas. Apex Chronicle.